Hello, class. This week we're introducing ourselves to the umbrella term speculative fiction. We've already been working within speculative fiction because magical realism is a genre of the speculative. This week and next week we're going to be talking about Gothic and horror. And the PowerPoint lays out a lot of different examples of these. But one thing that we want to remember is that the Gothic and the horror both are sustained by fear. Fear is the motivating and sustaining emotion of both Gothic and horror forms. And in the Gothic, at least in the classic Gothic, and there is a distinction between classic and American Gothic, which we'll make, and even Southern Gothic, we're going to look at Lovecraft country, and this is an example of Southern Gothic. In the Gothic, we have castles, ruined moors, very often what is happening on the outside, very often atmospheric, dark settings, maybe war-torn settings even, or very mysterious settings. Pretty much stand for internal aspects of characters. Southern Gothic, as we're going to see with Lovecraft country, very often uses elements of the grotesque to comment on the legacy of slavery and maybe race inequities in the American South. There's also such a thing as suburban Gothic. Maybe you've seen Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is a great example of the suburban Gothic, another American form, or not necessarily an American form, but it's a contemporary form that plays upon the idea that even the most ordinary looking neighborhood or house could have something to hide. There's frontier Gothic. So the Gothic is an expansive type of form, just like the fantastic is. Now we're going to learn a little bit about the difference between the fantastic and the magical in this PowerPoint as well. The fantastic is associated with the scholar Tsvetan Todorov, and he talks a little bit differently about fantastic elements. There are a couple of links in this PowerPoint that it would be really great if you could just check out, especially as you're working through those definitions. So, jumping right into things, we've already talked about one speculative form, which is magical realism. Now, here's the thing about speculative fiction. And a lot of us probably know this because we've seen films that are speculative or have read works that are speculative. And basically, speculative fiction is this umbrella term that doesn't really have an agreed upon definition, but it is generally associated with fiction that relies on everything from science fiction and fantasy to magical realism. Speculative fiction is often associated with women writers of genre fiction, and that's changing a little bit. But a lot of this has to do with, in the late 90s, the journal Spec, and also the idea that speculative fiction is inherently questioning the status quo, and very often patriarchal structures or class-based structures or systems of inequity based in gender or race or even ethnicity. Now, Tales of ratiocination is an older term that's associated with works that are somewhat in the Gothic realm, but also in the realm of early 20th century experimental forms. Someone like Edgar Allan Poe is associated with what are called tales of ratiocination. Basically, the idea is that the reader plays an important role in the discovery of elements, necessary elements of plot within the story. So, for instance, in this slide, Poe does not allow the reader to sit back and merely observe. The process of ratiocination, which he sets up, is also intended for the reader as well as for the detective. And so this refers to Poe's early detective works. And if you've seen detective novels, very often you are brought into the work itself to follow patterns, to figure out elements of the story arc that are going to lead to that eventual conclusion. So the Gothic is associated with earlier tales of ratiocination. Now here we have the fantastic. The fantastic is related to magical realism, but it's associated with Tsvetan Todorov. And for Todorov, what's very important is this hesitation. Now, we've talked about this idea of hesitation before with Wendy Ferris. One of the elements of magical realism that Ferris says is very important is doubt or hesitation on the reader's part. Now, Todorov expands this to discuss how when characters in a story doubt or hesitate, then that fantastic element is clearly at work. So for Todorov, you've got two possible avenues. You have the marvelous, which cannot be explained by the laws of our world, which is more in line with magical realism, and then the uncanny, that which can be explained and is sometimes either a delusion or an aspect of one's imagination or the senses. So we'll talk about these forms. Now, there is a short video that I've asked you to watch, and this is going to be really helpful in placing you in a position to understand more classic Gothic forms and then more contemporary Gothic forms, like the Southern Gothic forms that we're going to be looking at. But here's the thing about the Gothic, is that very often we find the Gothic arising at a time of great social or economic upheaval. It often explores the instability of certain patterns of domination or submission. For instance, the domestic form. Very often you begin with a fractured family or a fractured domestic form in an old house, in a dark setting, and that in itself is a Gothic element. We're always going to find patterns that are mysterious or supernatural in the Gothic. And we're also going to find lots of archetypes and especially doubles. Doubles are really important in the Gothic. Characters are often doubled, this idea between self and other. So very often what you're going to see are mirrors of people in Gothic. Now, this is why I've asked us to take a look at this short video, because the short video outlines some of these classic Gothic forms. And if you know anything about Dracula or Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or if you've seen any Tim Burton films, you know a little bit about the Gothic. Central to Gothic is this idea of this kind of deal with the devil, which kind of portrays this contradiction of the American project, a new start that celebrated its own innocence while simultaneously engaging in large-scale crimes. And this is where our reading of Lovecraft Country is going to get really interesting, because what we'll always find in the Gothic is that the Gothic works at a level on the surface, of course, but it is dredging earlier horrors. It is dredging historical past horrors, very often associated with the legacy of slavery. Now, For this, we can look straight to the Southern Gothic, which is a subgenre of American Gothic, and which basically fits patterns that we're going to find in Lovecraft country. Central characters are often deeply flawed, disturbing, and the Southern Gothic is rooted in the South's tensions that are generally related to class and racial inequities. Again, just like the Gothic itself, supernatural, sometimes ironic elements guide the plot. And when we deal with archetypes in the Gothic, these are modern archetypes. They're not moralizing archetypes. And we'll talk a little bit about this. Southern Gothic often features grotesques or elements of black comedy or absurdism. And maybe you know the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, which are rooted more in classic American Gothic forms. And maybe you know something like Beloved, which is more of a Southern Gothic work. When we talk about palimpsest, a palimpsest is a manuscript page from which a scroll or a book has been written upon. And basically the text has been scraped off. So here's a definition. A palimpsest is a manuscript page from a scroll or a book from which the text has been scraped off and which can be used again. And the idea of history as palimpsest refers to this concept that history is never fully gone, is never fully evaporated from the present landscape. And we see it come up in strange, disturbing, mysterious, and quite supernatural ways in the Gothic. So let's move on to the horror form, which is another genre that is related to the speculative. Again, it falls under the umbrella of the speculative. And at the simplest level, horror involves a threat against what we imagine to be normal. It's a breach in the purity of the nature of being. It's inherently transgressive. And here's the thing about horror is that we are simultaneously attracted and repulsed by it. So if you think about zombies, zombies are humans who have died, who should be dead, but they're not, right? So once again, that's a breach in the nature of being. Horror has roots in folklore, histories, oral histories, such as those histories surrounding angels and demons, as well as Gothic forms. Because remember, once you look at that little video, you'll see that the Gothic goes all the way back to 17th century England. Like the Gothic, horror promotes an emotional and physical response, as well as a psychological response. For Lovecraft, horror is the oldest and strongest emotion. And this is indebted to the fear that horror brings. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. And for him, this is cosmic horror. Stephen King speaks a little differently about this. He talks about 3 levels of horror. So what I've got next here is a link to the January 1927 version of Weird Tales, the horror at Red Hook, which came out in 1927. And if you link on this, what you're going to do is you're going to get to a page that's got a lot of information as far as the work itself is concerned. So you might want to take a look at that. Finally, the final slide here are terms, and I've got 2 terms, the abject and the uncanny, which you should look up by clicking on this final link here.